Yeah. Wow. And these shoes are called fish and chips. Okay.
I know it's the last talk. I know it's not my fault. Let's get it over with.
No. Let's enjoy it.
This is insane.
So I also have an old avant-garde, an old and well-known avant-garde, but I don't have simultaneous. I definitely don't have simultaneities. I think even less resistance. My name's Ryan Platt. I teach performance studies in a theater and dance department. A lot of my work has to do with challenging conventional notions of presence and liveness in performance, and particularly in the experimental tradition. It's sort of proposition. It's my feeling that if one takes performance and performativity seriously, it means that performance, by definition, repeats and doesn't take place entirely in the present or in the immediate boundaries of the scene. And that's what brings me here, but maybe not now, in order to think about how sound might turn us spectators away from theater, which literally means a place from which to see, and to turn them properly into audiences. And I'm going to briefly go off script from my scripted preamble because I wanted to recognize, and I warned you this, that I want to express my admiration and appreciation for Nikki's talk on mothering and love, which really resonated with me. And love is a word that I haven't had the courage to use, preferring instead meaning and care. And I think I really care about care. And I felt like going back to the often cited opening invocation given by Mark about the inauguration of the post-truth. You said some other things too, but I can't remember what they were. About the post. I care about Trump. About the post. Oh no, I think we need to care about him. About the post-truth era inaugurated by Trump. It seems to me that care and meaning, and taking care with our meaning, is more important than ever, rather than vice versa. But indeed, if we are properly post-truth, what kind of care and meaning might still be out there, possible? And that's where I'll begin. So I'm going to ask for a little help on this question. I'm going to ask for help from Jean-Luc Nancy. Jean-Luc Nancy is a key figure in post-structuralism and has authored deconstructive readings of philosophers from Descartes to Lacan, as well as analyzing aesthetics and artists, notably including a fascinating, problematic short treatise on sound published in 2002 as À l'écoute, and in 2009 under its English title, Listening. As in many of his works, listening has strong ties to German aesthetics and philosophy, which reflects Nancy's lifelong university appointment in Strasbourg on the Franco-German border. Nancy's philosophy frequently deals with borders and boundaries in a phenomenologically inflected way that emphasizes the material or sensible matter, which is part of what he calls son, a multivalent term that denotes both physical sense and meaning, as well as path and orientation. Although it thus allows for wide-ranging play, Nancy's concept of sense, is not predicated on the negation of meaning, that is, meaning defined as signification, and so provides an affirmation that Nancy believes is desperately needed, an affirmation of our being with others in the world. This sense of affirmation, however, is never complete or fully present, but remains strangely dispersed in distance, which leads him in listening to relate sense to an auditory concept, resonance. In this regard, Nancy's thoughts on sound are relevant to a musical composition all about resonance, Alvin Lucier's 1969 classic, I Am Sitting in a Room. In this canonical piece of experimental music, Lucier recorded himself on tape, speaking in his faculty apartment at Wesleyan, and then replayed this tape from the same position in the room while making another recording. He repeated this process 14 more times, which limited the range of sound to the resonant frequencies of his room. thus transforming his speech into a multi-layered composite that he describes as music. And although many people in this room may be familiar with it, I think it's good to still have a representative sample of, and also honors the act of actually listening. So I want to play a little bit of it. And this comes from the 1980 recording by Lovely Music, which is really, I think, the most canonical one. The whole recording is 42 minutes long. This iteration of I'm Sitting in a Room had 32 generations of speech. And I'm going to approach it in 3 sections. So the first section is I want to just play the full roughly 30 seconds of the first iteration of his speech. I then want to jump to the beginning where you begin to hear it degenerating, about 6 to 8 minutes in, and then I'm going to go somewhere in the end into the music. And I think that along the way, especially in the beginning when he's speaking, I'd like to stress that you might listen to, take note of the unusual cadence of his speech and the instances of stuttering, which I'll refer to later in the paper. Where am I? Oh no.
Escape.
Thank you. I don't.
Always escape.
If you can.
I am sitting in a room different from the one you are in now. I am recording the sound of my speaking voice, and I am going to play it back into the room again and again until the resonant frequencies of the room reinforce themselves, so that any semblance of my speech, with perhaps the exception of rhythm, is destroyed. What you will hear then are the natural resonant frequencies of the room articulated by speech. More is a way to smooth out any irregularities my speech might have. I am sitting in a room.
Instead of high and low tones, this music derives from the actual length of the sound waves that can pass unobstructed through his room. As composer James Tenney observes, this approach reflects Lucier's emphasis on sound as a physical phenomenon, which allows him to avoid hallmarks of conventional composition, such as the authorial intervention and self-expression. In the late 60s, the rejection of these authorial principles often contributed to artists' negation of transcendental values in favor of the lived material reality of everyday life. Unlike this process of negation, I maintain that I'm sitting in a room amounts to an affirmation. However, Lucier's techniques, the degeneration of the spoken statement, the essential importance of recording, and the use of resonance interfere with this affirmation. As the prefix RE suggests, resonance is an iterative, ongoing process that requires repetition. As such, Lucier's resonance adheres to a different notion of presence, which is never complete and confounds conventional definitions of sound. It is notoriously difficult to define the sound of resonance if I am sitting in a room. By any standards, this sound is not music, despite what Lucier says, but neither is it noise, nor does it contain dissonant or conflicting tones. Certainly, the sound of this resonance is not indeterminate, and therefore does not produce the sort of noise common in the experimental music tradition. In fact, it consists of manifestly meaningful material, Lucier's speech. Although it becomes impossible to discern the content conveyed by Lucier's words, "I am sitting in a word" does not eliminate their presence, which audibly inflects the sound. With each recurrence, this sound reminds audiences that they are still listening to Lucier's words, as if it were nearly possible to make them out. In this way, after ceasing to communicate intelligible information, the sound of resonance suspends the specific significance of Lucier's speech, but preserves their meaning, or rather, a sense of them being there. This status of meaning, and "I am sitting in a room," relates to Nancy's theory in listening, which subordinates the communicative function of sound to its material dimensions. This approach provides the basis for Nancy's definition of two opposing oral registers: écouter, listening, and entendre, hearing. As he reminds readers, the word entendre designates hearing, but also means comprendre, or to understand, and therefore relates to conventional regimes of referential meaning. Nancy, not surprisingly, is firmly on the side of listening, which he associates with the sensuous, physical aspects of sounds. In one sense, its sense. However, this opposition is not absolute. Despite being linked to intellectual understanding, hearing deals with sensuous aspects of sound and vice versa. For Nancy, listening to the sense of sound still encounters some degree of referential meaning, which remains peripherally present. In his words, to listen is to be straining towards a possible meaning that is not immediately accessible. It's telling that this meaning is not inaccessible or foreclosed for Nancy, but merely out of reach, as if strangely far away. In order to account for this strange state of sense, Nancy introduces another concept: resonant meaning. Nancy maintains that resonance is an acoustic phenomenon and also has a referential function. Rather than a signifying relationship, he states that resonant meaning is made of a totality of referrals, or renvoi, which also translates as return. As return suggests, his definition emphasizes that these referrals constantly recur in an ongoing process that adjusts and adapts to preceding points of reference. With this in mind, Nancy compares the recurrent character of referential meaning to the physical passage of sound, which produces vibrations that continue to affect it on into the present. According to his description, sound is not a unified phenomenon, but instead creates a self-reinforcing vibratory continuum that spreads out in space. As part of this continuum, sound re-emits itself and resounds, which lead Nancy to declare that sound consists of nothing else but referring back to itself. This definition of resonance helps to characterize the unusual nature of sound and "I am sitting in a room." Like Nancy's definition, Lucier's compositional process continuously builds on previous material, which returns in multi-layered clusters. In these elongated clusters, sound refers back to itself and allows previous elements to resound, even while continuing to evolve and change. This process of ceaseless self-reference simultaneously proceeds and recedes in a back-and-forth pattern, which Nancy describes as the coming and going quality unique to the sonorous. This process of coming and going informs the rhythmic character of "I am sitting in a room," which rises and falls in undulating swells interspersed with restive lulls. This rising and falling is audible in abstract sound and also inflects Lucier's speech, which briefly pauses after each phrase. In succession, the accumulation of these pauses imparts a musical quality that interferes with the meaning of his words and thus relays their resonant sense, that is, the perpetual repetition of self-reference. This repeated process of self-reference also affects the tempo of "I am sitting in a room." Instead of moving purposely forward, "I am sitting in a room" slows down as if perpetually backtracking. This backtracking tempo is initially audible in the restrained rate of Lucier's speech, which becomes increasingly undefined as the meaning of his words fades until the piece's trajectory itself seems aimless and almost distracting. This distraction relates to the structure of I am sitting in a room, which is not organized according to a unifying principle. Without a unifying principle, sound drifts in a confusing mass. Instead of being divided into particular units, this mass of sound results from successive iterations, which proceed one at a time and so remain singular. In addition to sound, there are other singular elements in I am sitting in a room, notably including the space. The spatial dimensions of Lucier's room have a specific resonant frequency that determine its sound, which would be different in any other location. As such, Lucier's audience can literally listen to a space, the space that he once occupied. However, the music does not communicate anything particular about this space, but simply provides a sense of the actual fact of being there. In other words, the sound of space in I am sitting in a room relays and affirms a singular instance of being. For this reason, Lucier's first words, I am, use the singular present tense to announce, I am sitting in a room, different from the one you were sitting in now. As the word now indicates, this statement also introduces a second instance of the present, the audience's presence in the room, which is different from Lucier's, but also the same, a continuation. Like Lucier, we too, and I mean we, are assembled in a room, each being besides one another in a room, and one another in turn. You are sitting in a room, and 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 so on. In this singular order, it is possible to be together with one another, but just not all at once. As Nancy would have it, the sound or sense of resonance reverberates and reinforces itself without ever coming together as a whole. This is an affirmation of being all right, a state of being that Nancy calls being singular plural. This affirmation also applies to another singular aspect of I am sitting in a room, Lucier's stutter, which evokes an unspoken reserve of personal feelings about himself. For Lucier, stuttering was a source of anxiety that he wanted to remedy using the compositional method of I am sitting in a room. And I realized I jumped the gun at the beginning of the text. I'm breaking my flow. But I actually cut off the last line of the first iteration, which I'm about to read. In the spoken text's final words, he explains this goal. I regard this activity not so much as a demonstration of a physical fact, but more as a way to smooth out any irregularities my speech may have. In contrast to disrupting communication, Lucier wants to smooth and soothe his stutter. In an interview with Brian Kane, Lucier recounts that he originally thought that the process of replaying his speech in order to create resonance would allow him to slow down and listen to himself. Like Nancy's concept of resonance, this description emphasizes the repetitive function of self-reference or self-listening, which suspends signification and thus provides relief from the imperative to use language in an immediately meaningful way. Furthermore, this relief is not exclusive to Lucier. As he recounts, many people experience this struggle to make meaningful sense. While not everyone stutters, everyone has a certain amount of anxiety about speech. Instead of an isolated condition, Lucier treats stuttering as a shared shortcoming, which means that this process of self-affirmation has value for others. Listening to I am sitting in a room affirms the self, just not an autonomous and self-contained self. On this basis, I think it's appropriate to think of listening as a kind of self-care. Caring for oneself requires constant attention, which Nancy claims is part of the word for listening, écouter. According to Nancy, écouter derives from auscultare, whose roots mean to incline or lend an ear. He then states that to listen is to prick up one's ears, or tendre l'oreille, which literally means to stretch the ear, and, in his words, evokes a singular mobility of the pinna of the ear, resulting in an intensification and a concern, a curiosity, or an anxiety. This anxious inattention occurs when audiences let go of the ability to understand expressions of meaningful intention. As meaning recedes, the intention detected by hearing, that is, entendre, or understanding, yields a tension inherent to the phrase tendre l'oreille. In addition to tensing, tendre also implies tenderness or care. It takes great care to attend to the subtle self-referential motion of sound, so that one may refrain from incurring the divisions and discontinuity that predicate signified meaning. As an alternative to such painful divisions, Nancy emphasizes the continuity of sound, which indefinitely expands and stretches out through space, while assuming figures such as a loop or waves on a swell that continuously return in a circular pattern. Since it avoids incurring divisions, this unbroken succession of sonorous material enfolds listeners in multiplying layers of resonant sound, which reassures and protects the self, while also being strangely restrained. Maybe it's a good moment to revisit that. Oops. Oh, I'm sorry. Let's do it again. But wait. This confining yet comforting space seems all too familiar. Could it be that this room is the womb? In listening, at least, it is. And Nancy expressly compares resonance to the womb using the word matrice. As musicologist Sarah Hickmott argues in an excellent essay on listening, Nancy's construal of the womb-like constitution of resonance repeats an old trope that posits the origin of matter in the maternal, which is figured as a void or hollow that supports physical substance but has none itself. Cast as disembodied material support, this womb or broom occupies a spurious prediscursive stage. As if to leave readers without any doubt as to the status of this womb, Nancy ends listening not with a coda that reflects not on music, but rather an allegorical painting about music. There goes the slide. Oops, I'm really blowing it. There we go. Titian's Venus with Organist and Cupid. And I'll just let this speak for itself. Philosophical sexism aside, this prediscursive sphere has troubling consequences for resonance, which Nancy often describes in similar terms as being before and prior to signification. Certainly, it sets the affirmation laid out in listening on shaky ground and leaves more questions than answers. For starters, does this essentialist notion of matter also impact Nancy's concept of sense? If so, is it possible to recuperate either sense or nonsense, if not both? And what consequences do these questions have for I am sitting in a room? As a provisional answer, I propose that renewed attention to Lucier's techniques might critically inform Nancy's philosophy of sound, which presumes resonance to be a natural phenomenon. In contrast to Nancy's naturalization of the maternal body and of resonant bodies in general, resonance in I am sitting in a room results from Lucier's repetitive process of recording himself on tape. Given this prominent use of analog media, I am sitting in a room suggests a rude return to Nazi's philosophy of sound by way of his influential concept of ecnotechnics, which goes unmentioned in listening. Might ecotechnics be sufficient to rehabilitate resonance? Is the theory of resonance presented in listening compatible with ecotechnics? Despite their specificity, these questions have high stakes because resonance offers an alternative to both self-presence and the extensive lexicon of disruptions used by artists to negate it. Unlike naive self-presence or its negation, resonance offers something everyone needs, a strangely affirmative sense of being with others, in a room, side by side, in singular order. Thanks.